Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. Welcome to our expert session, Context is the New Foundation for AI-Ready Governance, brought to you by our friends at Actian. I'm Brian Mink, co-founder and president of Data Science Connect, the world's largest data and AI ecosystem for enterprise leaders. Today, we're excited to welcome attendees from all over the world to explore how organizations can build trusted, AI-ready data foundations by strengthening business context, governance, and data stewardship. As organizations accelerate AI and analytics initiatives, one challenge keeps surfacing. Enterprise data is only as useful as the context behind it. Business definitions, ownership, metadata, lineage, and data quality signals all play a critical role in whether teams can trust, govern, and activate their data effectively. But in many organizations, that context is incomplete, outdated, or scattered across systems. As a result, governance programs struggle to keep pace, data catalogs lose relevance, and AI initiatives face greater risk around accuracy, reliability, and accountability. Today's panel discussion will explore how data leaders are rethinking governance and stewardship for the AI era. We're honored to hear from a distinguished panel of experts today. Betty Wang, Senior Engineer at Actian, Amit Panalkar, Senior Director of Data Science at Fiserv, and Jared Maslin, Senior Principal Market Solutions at Slalom. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. To make this feel a little more in person, we suggest you add a photo to your profile and include your bio, LinkedIn profile, and other information you want your fellow attendees to see. Next, please take advantage of the Q&A and chat features in the right sidebar. We'll be addressing your questions throughout the webinar, so be sure to upvote the questions you'd like the panel to address. And finally, to learn more about how to build trusted AI-ready data foundations through stronger business context and scalable governance, check out the call to action below throughout the webinar. Now I'm going to hand things over to Betty to discuss how Actian is helping organizations solve these challenges, followed by our panel discussion with Betty, Amit, and Jared. Welcome, Betty.
Hi, Brian. Good to be here.
Thank you. And if you just want to share your screen, I'll make sure it's working and then turn things over to you.
Yep, absolutely. Let me know when you can see it.
Looks good. It's all yours.
Awesome. All right. Hi, everyone. I think we're all here to talk about how AI initiatives are really only as good as the data context behind them. So, we've seen a lot of enterprises grow, and with that, the data environments grow. And with that, the metadata, often goes stale, right? Ownership can become unclear, business definitions drift, and this leaves a lot of the AI systems that you're working with to stem from incomplete or conflicting information. This is why Actian has introduced the Data Steward Agent, which really acts like your digital AI assistant. It's embedded directly within the Actian Data Intelligence platform, and it works continuously inside your catalog workflows. So it's really helping with the automated enrichment and maintainment of your metadata as your data landscape evolves. So for example, within this chat, I can ask it a simple question like, why is this staging customer data set incomplete? Once that agent surfaces the root cause and recommends a clear path to resolution, it also breaks down the factors driving the completeness score. And this is all based on a configurable meta model that you set up. And not only does it break down the reasoning, like how completion is defined, with glossary needing to have at least 2 terms, description, context, and required properties. It also intelligently suggests next steps that you can take, whether that means updating a specific field, or in our case, what we're going to show is initiating a bulk remediation plan. So for every recommendation that it suggests, it's actually grounded in real context. The logic that it's going through is going to look at peer data sets for contact recommendations that it would make, looking at the contents of your table to generate that description summary, and also looking at things like social security for how it classifies your sensitivity, right? And so this allows you to get really precise, reliable suggestions without hallucination. And of course, before anything really changes here, as we do this bulk update, it's always going to ask a human to review and approve. So this allows to keep control within your team at every step. So the agent here that we're introducing with Data Steward isn't really trying to replace the role completely. It's really designed to eliminate more of that manual bottleneck so that your governance and stewardship team can focus on the strategic decisions, not necessarily documentation. And because it's grounded in things like the knowledge graph behind the scenes and your meta model, every agent, every analyst, and every workflow that it operates from is built on that same trusted semantic context. So you can see now the completion level has updated accordingly with the new fields that were created. This is just an example, right, of how we're really trying to empower data stewardship and governance to really keep pace with the speed of AI. All right, Brian, I'll turn it back over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Betty. Very interesting presentation. And now I'm going to bring on our panel discussion. Jared and Amit, welcome. Great to have you guys, and thanks for joining us today. And let's pick up our conversation on the new data foundation for AI ready governance. So before we get into the meat of the conversation, we'll just do some quick intros. So Betty, why don't you kick us off, and then we'll go to Amit and Jared. And if you could just tell me a bit more about your current role and how data governance, stewardship, or business context fits into your broader data and AI strategy. So Betty, why don't you start things off?
Yeah, sounds good. I'm a solutions engineer here at Actian. So primarily I work with customers in the pre-sale cycle, running demonstrations, architecting solutions, and really showing them how Actian can fit in their environment. To me, governance and context really aren't separate from AI strategy. They're the foundation, right? So we're helping customers get it right before AI enters the conversation. So from my lens, it's very hands-on, it's very technical. I can see firsthand, what happens when governance and context are more afterthoughts and what it takes to make it really work in practice.
Absolutely. Amit, what are your thoughts?
Hey, thank you, everyone. Amit Panalkar here. I work at Fiserv. I lead data science and AI initiatives here for different internal and external facing products and services, catering to dozens of clients and also handling petabyte scale of data. Prior to Fiserv, I was at BlackRock leading AI for portfolio analytics, so similar functions. And I think this topic is very near and dear to me. I think it's extremely important in terms of how context is important, how governance and auditability is very core to what we are trying to do. And as things accelerate, more and more of these things get pushed up the value chain, and it's extremely important to know what the data means, who owns it, where it comes from, how is it good. A lot of these things are being incorporated in various cloud platforms that are being built. You talk about Databricks Unity Catalog, AWS Glue, etc., etc. But still, there's a lot more to be done in terms of how governance is being captured, not as like a few times in the value process as a gate, but more close to a continuous process. So very excited to hear what everybody's saying and share some of my thoughts. Thank you.
Absolutely. Jared.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate it. I'm Jared Maslin, Senior Principal at Slalom, where I focus on helping organizations turn data, AI, and governance investments into measurable business outcomes. For me, governance isn't a control function. It's more of an enablement capability. The organizations seeing the greatest value and reliable performance from AI are the ones that have established clear ownership, trusted data, and consistent business context. Governance and stewardship, as Betty said, they help create the foundation by making data more understandable, trustworthy, and reusable across an enterprise as opposed to in a silo. So at Slalom, we think about governance as a way to accelerate innovation responsibly. When teams know what data exists, who owns it, how it's defined, whether it can be trusted, once that's determined, then they're able to move faster with things like analytics, automation, and AI. So I often say it's about creating seatbelts and airbags, not speed bumps. So excited to be here today. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that line, Jared. And I just want to double click on the concept of data stewardship for a minute, since you mentioned that. So a lot of folks, when they hear data stewardship, they think about, well, that sounds like a lot of work, sounds like a lot of manual effort. My team's already stretched super thin. So from your experience, how are organizations able to put governance and stewardship into practice? What does scalable stewardship look like in a modern enterprise environment?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's a serious problem at every organization across industries. I think historically, data stewardship has really been treated as an additional responsibility that gets assigned to teams that are already very busy, have competing priorities, and don't have the bandwidth. And as you can imagine, that's really rarely sustainable. So when we think about scalable stewardship, it starts with recognizing that stewardship isn't a person, it's an operating model. It's a way of behaving. The goal isn't to create more manual work or to create more work in general. The goal is to embed stewardship into everyday processes and then to augment that with automation. So in modern organizations, we're seeing successful teams leverage metadata platforms, data catalogs, lineage, data quality monitoring, and AI assisted, even moving into agentic workflows to automate routine governance activities and free up those subject matter experts to focus on decisions that require business judgment rather than administrative tasks. So ultimately, we're seeing that the most effective model combines clear accountability, well-defined processes, and technology that reduces friction. So when stewardship gets built into how data is created, how it's managed, how it's consumed, then it can scale with the business rather than becoming a bottleneck.
So
Yeah.
I would like to add, I think that Jared made an excellent point in terms of it's not being a particular person, but an operating model. I think that's very important differentiator, right? Jared talked about the lineage, ownership, and so on. I think those are very critical elements. And to draw an analogy, right, talk about Anthropic, right? How we used to operate on prompt engineering and now move to context engineering. Like you're not doing handcrafting anymore, but you're creating systems that maintains the context. So I think similarly, like, when you talk about stewardship, it's all about creating the operating model and function. Thanks, Jared.
Yeah, and I think just to follow up on that, right? I think that's the exact demo that is trying to communicate with the data steward agent. It really is not to just replace that role, because we still need that human knowledge of, it's kind of like what Jared said. It's often people are wearing different hats. It's coming from a data engineer or someone that is really close to the data that understands what needs to belong there, but is often kind of burdened with the manual description writing or creating those relationships, right? So we're really creating that agent to eliminate that manual lift and have them focus on more their day-to-day jobs.
Yeah, great points. And just turning to a bit more on the context of governance. So Jared, you mentioned the word bottleneck, and I think that is often a perception of governance over the years, is that it can be a bottleneck, that this is, it's just another hoop we have to jump through, even if it's important. It gets in the way of innovation is often how it is viewed. Amit, from the perspective of someone who's in a large enterprise, thinking through how governance looks today in the world of AI, how do you create governance practices that improve trust while also not slowing down teams that are looking to innovate?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks for that question. I think it's super important that we have the governance guardrails on, and of course, we at enterprise scale we don't want to slow. We want that to be an accelerant. So there's some key components to it. I think first is it, like any other thing, it needs to be very custom. So the process of governance needs to match the process we're talking about. Not everything needs the same level of scrutiny, because it will slow things down. So there's a decision framework that at Fiserv and many other organizations have created, which they revisit regularly. Where low risk processes that we have here go through some automated checks. We have some scripts and agents created, so it doesn't wait in the line. But something that is more critical need SME approval, that goes through a proper review process. And post the review process, you try to automate and create agents that look into that. I think second thing is, so it's the solution needs to, even in the governance, needs to move towards the governed tools or AI agent governed tools, not really residing at the table stage. So the clarity of the specs is very important as you do this. It's like the same principle, like agents are looking at different data, reaching out to different data, but as long as the guardrails are established and it's governed, I think process becomes very fast. So these tools becomes more context efficient tools, and then agent is able to steer them more appropriately. So I think these two things I think very important. And similarly, if you have as people are more moving to just in time retrieval of data and grounding the models, the trust becomes very important. So having the right set of permissions on these governed tools becomes key. Yet another third thing I would like to highlight is uh, these guardrails like being built into the tool itself rather than any downstream process. So people have, I'm sure, are familiar with things like Unity Catalog, where you can, if you go to a very granular scale, you can tag a particular column in terms of how sensitive it is. So once you do that, it carries through to all subsequent processes and motions of analysis and data science work, including data contracts and verification loops. So I think these are some of the key things. Like I said earlier in my intro, things need to move upstream as you're defining these specs and enabling at the tool level itself. So governance becomes more continuous rather than a more discrete process, which requires a certain gate and which essentially slows down the things. Thank you.
Yeah, to add to that, I think because as you were mentioning things moving upstream, the most success and the least amount of friction that we can see is by making it almost invisible to the user. And that's one reason why we're seeing changes from traditional role-based access controls, or RBAC, to attribute-based access controls, or ABAC. And that's really empowered by the platform that was demoed here earlier. When you have that rich business context, you're able to, instead of having massive role explosion, you're able to have ABAC-based controls that are looking at the context of a request, that are looking at the individual, and that are making runtime decisions regarding access. Instead of every time I need something new, I have to know what role or entitlement to request and go grab that. Mm-hmm. So it's part of that foundation that without it, we can't get to that next step.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what's happening today with agents being developed everywhere is really trying to bring the answers to the user in the platform that they're already working, right? So it's less about even necessarily going into the catalog platform, but MCP and going in Claude and having that being connected to your data catalog underneath, so that the answers are grounded in that context.
Yeah, great points about context, and we have a question in the chat from Robbie that tees up nicely for our next question as well. So Robbie's asking about data quality and says, as part of governance, the efficacy of data should be at the core, but I hardly hear anyone talk about data quality during governance. And I'll ask as well the question that I intended to ask next about metadata management, because I think it relates nicely to this question, which is a lot of teams are investing in metadata management, but the fact is not all that metadata drives business value. So Betty, from the technology side, what kinds of metadata in business context are actually most useful for governance, analytics, and AI? How can organizations avoid creating documentation or spinning their wheels on data quality efforts that are not actually fruitful, don't actually yield ROI, and how do you tell the difference?
Yeah, Ravi, I think that's a great point. Governance to us doesn't necessarily mean just kind of cataloging and access control, right? The trust in the data is a core pillar of what we believe in our product offering here at Actian. As far as, what sort of metadata is important, I mean, I honestly hate to give the age-old consulting answer, but it really depends on the organization and the business need that's driving it, right? Like a regulated bank, I think, is going to put a lot more weight on things like lineage or PII classification, and maybe a marketing team that's more focused on self-service analytics might not be as focused on that. But there are a few things I think that we hear as a common trend, right? Like technical metadata, lineage, plus the quality, right? Especially as it's moving throughout the pipeline and paired with the business context. So having clear definitions and ownership so people can really trust what's in your ecosystem without needing to call IT. And all of that, I think, kind of joins together in the semantic layer that your AI agents are built on top of, so that when someone is looking at what does customer mean, right? It's grounded in that business context, not just a column name. And as far as, avoiding shelfware, I think just try to automate as much as possible where it makes sense. Metadata harvesting has been automated for a long time in the space. Now, when we have AI, you can let AI do that first pass at tagging, but still have the human intervention. And I mentioned this before, but a lot of where we're moving towards is really surfacing that context inside the tools that people already use to avoid the problem of it becoming shelfware. So you're really meeting the user where they're already working.
Yeah, and thanks, Betty. It's real quick on that. I think excellent point, Betty. And I think as we move to the agentic era, I think this metadata that we talk about is human readable, but equally machine readable. So talking about definitions, relationships, quality signal, so they all become important part of this whole process to kind of keep the metadata relevant to different use cases and different access tools.
And since I think it's directly related to what we're talking about right now, there was an additional comment about a semantic layer being a perfect example of context. Absolutely. Some organizations use those terms somewhat interchangeably to refer to that handshake between upstream source data and downstream analytics. And as Amit and Betty have shared, having the human engaged in that. It's one thing for it to be machine readable. That's very important, but it also needs to make sense to the business user, so that, as Betty said, when they think about a customer, that concept isn't being interpreted two different ways across two different groups. So that kind of consistency, that's really what a semantic layer is about. It's about creating that connection so that business context is following data into analytics as opposed to trying to reverse engineer that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we hear that example over and over from many of the executives that we speak with, which is many times, particularly in large enterprises, you've got all this siloed data. And for years, there have been different definitions of the same thing, different ways to measure the same KPI. And it creates a lot of havoc when you start trying to pull this together and start trying to leverage AI across an enterprise, across all of these different teams. So these are excellent points. Jared, I want to pick up that point and talk a bit more about adoption and behavior change within organizations that I think is tees up very nicely based on what you guys were just talking about. Even when you have a great governance framework in place, you've got great technology in place, adoption, getting actual users to actually use it and do it the way they're supposed to do it is always a challenge in every organization. What tends to determine whether governance actually becomes a part of how teams work day to day, as opposed to some separate compliance exercise they periodically do to check a box? How do you see that in organizations actually playing out?
Yeah, it's a really great point. It's something we're seeing in terms of token maxing and driving behavior that wasn't really intended. It's not just is it available and is it trusted, but is it being used as it's intended. So technology and frameworks are absolutely important, no question there. But adoption is actually, in my opinion, more of a critical people challenge and an organizational culture challenge. Organizations that we see excelling here make governance relevant to the teams that are already trying to accomplish specific objectives instead of creating new work streams and new roundabout approaches. If governance is positioned as compliance, and I've been in the compliance space for a long time, adoption tends to be very limited. If it's positioned instead as a way to improve decision-making, reduce rework, increase trust in data, or accelerate AI initiatives, then we see engagement increasing significantly. And not just engagement, but the kind of engagement you're seeking as a business. So we found that there are three real core factors to helping this. The first is visible executive sponsorship. And I say visible because it needs to be front and center. We see some organizations try bottom-up governance. We see some trying to do top-down. I believe both are necessary because that reinforces not just what governance is, but why it matters to the business and why it matters to our objectives, not just because a policy says we need to. The second is clear accountability and ownership. People need to be able to understand what their role is and what their partners and colleagues' roles are, so that we all know what we're fulfilling and it's not just checking a box, it has a purpose. And then the last piece, which is a big one, is demonstrating business value. And in many organizations, you have to do this fast. If you come at governance, you come at these initiatives as an 18-month, trust me, there will be ROI once we get there, then you're likely not going to get off the launch pad. So when governance is really being integrated into existing workflows and teams can see tangible benefits related to that work, it can stop feeling like a separate program and start becoming part of how the organization operates every day. So ultimately what we see is the more successful governance programs don't create more process, they create confidence. And that confidence is what allows organizations to scale analytics, scale data products, and to scale AI responsibly and at scale.
Yeah, I can't echo that enough, even from, I know I'm representing more of the technology side, but technology can only fix so much, right? It has to be a mindset shift as well. It has to come from the top. People are the hardest thing to change. So Jared has the hard job here.
Yeah, we've talked a bit about context, so I want to drill down on that a bit, Betty. As organizations prepare data for AI use cases, what context does an AI system actually need in order to use enterprise data reliably? Are there certain definitions, relationships, lineage, or quality signals that become more important in an AI-driven environment specifically? And I saw there was a question in the chat about in the context of context. Timing and freshness of the data is another major factor, making sure that just because it had proper context at a point in time, that depending on the nature of what you're asking AI to do, that it has the proper context at the proper time. So elaborate on some of the considerations around context, if you will.
Yeah, I'll first kind of address the question that was in the chat. That's really what data observability is designed to do. Freshness is a key component of that, right? Understanding not that just the data is there, but how recent was it? And also not just at a point in time, but also as it moves across your data pipeline. So I know we're talking a lot about context and the governance piece, but by no means is that designed to minimalize the trust component as well. That plays a huge part in the entire foundation of what your AI is built on. As far as use cases, again, it's really going to depend on the organization, right? AI will act on the data with total confidence, whether it deserves it or not. So it's really whatever it takes to close that gap for the context is what matters. Sometimes it's the definition so that people have the reasoning in your business language. Sometimes it's the lineage to understand where the data is coming from so that your answers are explainable. You have traceability for audit. Sometimes it is those lab quality signals. So it's not necessarily just one thing, right? I would say it's the culmination of it all. And these are just examples, right? It's not necessarily just a checklist. I think the core principle we're trying to emphasize is AI needs enough of that context, especially when it doesn't know what it doesn't know, in the same way that a good analyst would. So as much context as you can provide on all facets, I would say is probably the rule of thumb here.
Yeah, thanks, Betty. Just to add, I think excellent point you made. And I think it kind of connects with also some of the knowledge graph and other evolution or revolution that we are looking. I think that also fits under the broader umbrella of context, because you're trying to have this relationship between entities nicely captured, not just a point in time, but across time. So that's like one of the sub themes here.
Yeah, that's a core aspect of what our platform is founded on is, especially as organizations are growing, there is going to be a need for a bit of a hybrid of, federation, but also centralization, right? So that knowledge graph is really important as different relationships are made, other, new data sets are created to have it all be connected almost instantaneously. Sorry, Jared.
No, that's great. Thank you. And I just wanted to add that that connects both to what Betty was describing, as well as the question around data quality in terms of, we're used to, in the prior advent of big data, the idea was, well, if some data is good, more data is better. But then we dealt with the garbage in, garbage out. Having more garbage just creates more garbage. That can sometimes get lost in AI because there's an opacity to what that model is trained on. But in reality, bad data being fed and context being generated off of that and then continually used will continue to drive that bias into a direction that doesn't serve your business. And it'll create filter bubbles that will be not very apparent to the users who are getting outputs and intending to use those for business purposes. So quality might not seem like it's critical, but its ability to become a big problem downstream, and one that can be hard to find, it can't be overstated.
Absolutely. And leads in nicely to a question from Tiffany. Tiffany asked, when a model decision is questioned months later, how difficult is it today to reconstruct exactly what happened, including the inputs, model version, outputs, and surrounding context? And I also want to add something to that, and I'll ask you first, Amit, in a complex enterprise environment, when you're trying to build your governance practices, and you need transparency and reliability, and there is a need for auditability to be able to diagnose what went wrong, where did this come from? How do you do that in a large enterprise environment where you're dealing with lots of complex inputs?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. I think I deal with it all the time. I think it boils down to explainability and defensibility of what you're doing. And like, I use Anthropic and other products. So I like to pick an analogy where their Anthropic runs like builds and run long running agents. So I think what it allows you to do, or the same concept of defensibility and explainability as it relates to auditability and risk compliance, is a your the ability to trace everything from start to end. They're talking about model, the features, the transformations, the source systems. So when you have internal compliance or regulator wants to understand the decision is being made for customers or clients, how did that traverse from like start to the end? I think that's it. So traceability is very important, and that's being actively built and paid attention to even in the agentic community. And second is just treating all this um, catalog and lineage, which are extremely important, as more of a durable memory. So as you're talking about giving agents the ability to have external memory and the state, it should survive when the context resets. So similarly, like you should have a persistent state that lives beyond when the model is kind of finished and kind of we move on to the new context. And there are different tools being used, like like Delta Lake, for example, and there are new emerging platforms that are even more advanced. So I think traceability and durable memory are super important, and so is like some of the old tried and tested adage of having version on the documents with the model. So if you're using a SageMaker, MLflow, all these registries are being saved, they're attached, and it retrains. So anytime there's a reason to go back and refer to that, there's a well-aligned summary. So yeah, I think beyond what humans have been doing, like in terms of explainability using SHAP or Lime or other models, I think this thing goes beyond that in terms of audit logs and how to adapt into the age of agentic AI.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think, and this is not a new practice, it's something that was back with initial machine learning algorithms that were being developed and rolled out. But I still see a considerable value and use of model cards to get that context of not just what was being developed, because you can automate aspects of model card reporting, which is fantastic, in being able to say what was created, what data it was trained off of, what outputs and actions were intended to be taken from that. But what's really hard to get in retrospect, especially since a lot of incidents and breaches and issues that occur, they don't always happen the next day. Sometimes they happen 6 weeks, 6 months later. That individual who was designing that may not even be in that same role or with that company anymore. And trying to get back into the mindset of the developer, of the engineer, 6 weeks, 6 months down the road is next to impossible. So there's an aspect of model card development focused on what is it intended to do. And then as we're seeing with different LLMs that are breaking outside their boundaries, a lot of the discussion is, well, it wasn't working the way we intended it to work. So there's what do you want to happen, and then there's what is actually happening from those. When you can generate that context up front through testing and from the individuals that are developing it, you can get both sides of that equation so that whether issues happen in 6 days, 6 weeks, or 6 months, you can more readily answer that question.
Yeah, excellent points. I want to talk a bit more about automation and how that plays a role in what we're able to do today in governance that maybe wasn't possible in the past or was much more difficult. Betty, where do you see technology and AI meaningfully reducing the manual burden of governance and stewardship today? What tasks do you find are good candidates for automation, and where do you think human oversight will still remain central?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what the data steward agent demo that I did up front was designed to address, right? I think what we're trying to solve for is the repetitive stewardship work that historically has been very manual. So things like creating definitions, drafting those classifications, assigning ownership, that's the sort of tasks that I think AI can take off someone's plate. And it does the first pass. It does the first pass, and it also explains what it's found in plain language, the logic behind it, how it's grounding its answers in the meta model that you design. And I think what should stay within the human judgment, right, is the approval, the actual, judgment call of, is this definition correct? Deciding ownership when there is a dispute, signing off for something before it actually touches production. So right now, I think we're really trying to leverage AI to handle a lot of the busy work, but the accountability ultimately should still be a human task.
Yeah, I think that mirrors to a lot of what we hear generally about what folks' observations of AI over the last several years as it's become more advanced, what AI is really good for, what it's less good for, and it's keeping that human judgment, but taking a lot of the busy work, as you said, and being able to automate that. So I think that's an excellent point. Another question that I want to address to Jared and Betty for starters is in terms of static documentation versus living context. So Jared, from what you're seeing across organizations, what has to change in terms of processes, ownership, or operating models to be able to move from a place where you're in a static documentation world towards having business context that stays current as data and systems change?
Yeah, absolutely. As we've talked about, there's cultural aspects and operating model aspects. So one of the biggest shifts that we see in organizations and that are really necessary for this kind of AI-enabled world is viewing business context as a living asset rather than as a documentation exercise or a check-the-box compliance task. Historically, governance programs relied on periodic reviews, manually maintained glossaries, and they quickly become outdated as systems, data products, and business processes evolve, especially with the advent of AI-enabled workflows and agentic workflows. So the organizations making the most progress in this space, they're actively embedding ownership directly into operational workflows that exist. And they're using metadata, lineage, and governance platforms to capture context as part of the work itself. So as I alluded to before, it's not about creating more process. It's about embedding these tasks that enable the kind of AI implementation and the kind of scale that we want and need at an enterprise level. They're creating accountability for business definitions, for critical data elements and policies, but they're also reducing manual maintenance through automation, and they're not coming together as an enterprise approach, an enterprise strategy. So that's something that we're seeing becoming more and more critical in terms of how we operate as a business and how we connect not just the risk up front and how we mitigate that, but also how we tie that to ROI, tie that to business outcomes, and become a revenue enabler as much as a cost reducer.
Yeah, I agree. I think, once the mindset is there, right, and the organization is set up, there is still a technology component. And I think if the technology is difficult to use, or to Jared's point, it doesn't tie back to business value, you're going to see a drop in adoption or very low adoption. And I think oftentimes with enterprise platforms like this, it can do so much, and you really have to understand exactly what the pain points are so you can curate the user experience. I think one thing that's one of the reasons Acting has kind of split out the UI between, hey, a data consumer comes in and has a very different journey than what a data steward would come in to do, right? So even just something as simple as that, splitting that out is, we've really seen that as an aspect to help drive adoption. So again, really mapping technology function and feature to a business use case and kind of return on investment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just like to add, I think it's been covered already, but education is important, I think, especially for senior stakeholders in terms of what it really entails, what are the tools we need, where we are, and what the vision is, 6, 9 months down the line. So I think this continuous education and use case, successful use case sharing, not just within the firm, but across the industry. I think those are important.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot about ROI and making the business case, and Tiffany makes a great point here on governance and how you might make that business case. So what governance activities consume the most time from data science or ML teams today? I think analyzing that question could be one thing that organizations jump at to be able to show the ROI of adopting more automated solutions around governance. So what do you guys find are some of the most time consuming activities in governance that is not more automated?
Well, I think from the perspective of data scientists, having been in that space, I think it was the case and is still the case that data wrangling and data cleansing is a significant aspect of that work, when in reality, you want your engineers and your developers and your data scientists to be a product that is using clean data confidently, instead of being that kind of data janitor, if you will, and having to clean those things up. I think that has only gotten more complex, not necessarily from the perspective of source data is more complex, but because now that we're introducing automation, we're introducing LLMs, we're introducing homegrown models, there's not just the inputs, but then there's the foundational grounding that's being used to evaluate those inputs and produce outputs. So I think from that perspective, enabling data scientists and engineers and analytics professionals to have confidence in the data that they're working with and the models they're leveraging, so that they can focus on that product development, they can focus on the outputs that they're intended to build, that gets better ROI for the business. You're using your very skilled resources to do very skilled work instead of trying to correct issues in retrospect. I think that's existed for quite some time, and I think it's only gotten more complex with the inclusion of AI and foundational models to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think so much of data quality, data observability can be in machine learning, right? There's pattern recognition that should be very standard. 3 numbers, a dash, 2 numbers, a dash, 4 numbers, right? That shouldn't need someone to go in and manually create a rule. That should just kick off on the very first scan and be able to pick up those patterns. So yeah, I think as data is growing exponentially, having that is really important. I also hear in a lot of my conversations, creating manual lineage, right? Like the stitching between the hops of your data sources oftentimes is very consuming. So, and as ecosystems grow, as people are, increasing their tech stack, that just multiplies, right? Because then, it is making more hops. It's going through a longer pipeline process. So any way that we can automate that lineage as much as possible to help users understand where their data is coming from, tracing it all the way back to the source is really important.
Yeah, I think I echo what was being said. Also, it's important for the data scientists and machine learning AI engineers to know upfront what the expectations are from the compliance, whether it's external compliance, OCC, etc., or internal compliance. So those are incorporated into the context right from day one. And we'll see our evolution where the governance itself will be more agentic. You talk about orchestrators and sub agents patterns show up in the governance. So I think with this expectation and kind of being built in the spec itself of the model development process will help a lot and make tasks easy for the data scientists.
Excellent points. I want to wrap up with our lightning round and ask each of you in one phrase or a sentence, what's your top recommendation for organizations trying to build more trusted AI-ready data foundations? Why don't we start with you, Amit?
Sure. I think I would say in one sentence, or two sentences rather. So AI is only as trustworthy as a context is feeding it, especially for LLMs and all the foundation model. And context engineering is a governance problem. It's not a modeling problem; it's also a governance paradigm.
Absolutely. Betty?
Yeah, I think if it wasn't obvious in this conversation, I really think you should invest in the context foundation before the AI use cases, right? Because the trusted AI starts with the trusted metadata context and semantic layer underneath.
Absolutely. Jared?
I would say don't boil the ocean. Instead, govern what matters most first, and then make that trust scalable.
Great insights from our panel. Really thank all of you for joining us today. It was a great spirited discussion, so much appreciated. And thank everyone in the audience for joining us as well. If you missed any of today's webinar or you want to rewatch any of it, the recording will be available in just a few minutes if you refresh this page, and we'll also send out the link to the recording on our YouTube channel tomorrow. Thank you again to all of our panelists, to all of our audience, and of course, a very special thank you to our partners at Actian for making this webinar possible. Make sure that you check out that product demo in the call to action below if you haven't already. Thank you all once again, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.